Hello, 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 and welcome back to the podcast. Did you know that researchers at Duke University and Penn State have found significant associations between social emotional skills in kindergarten and important young adult outcomes in education, employment, and mental health? My guest today is Jake Greenspan. He's the co-founder of the Floortime Center and co-author of the book, Overcoming ADHD, Helping Your Child Become Calm, Engaged, and Focused. He is here to discuss floor time. He's going to describe this approach and really discuss how this approach helps to establish and strengthen communication, thinking, self-control, and flexibility skills. Skills needed to be successful in life and in school. I hope you'll enjoy this episode.
Millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Jake, welcome back to the podcast. And I say welcome back for our listeners because Jake and I actually recorded this before and we had some tech issues. So we are re-recording just because it was such a great conversation. I didn't want to air it with bad quality. So we are having this conversation again. And thank you so much for this take two.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me again.
So, we have been discussing how to support children who think and learn differently. And, as I said to you, I wanted to have you on the podcast to discuss floor time because we haven't talked about it on this podcast. So I would love for you to first, as an introduction, tell our listeners what exactly is floor time.
Thank you for the good question. It's interesting. Every time I think about this, I think about different pieces of it. So it's nice to have a second go around to explain it because it's actually far more comprehensive than people often think it is. A lot of people associate floor time with just getting on the floor and playing with your child, or just letting a child do what they want and following their lead, as it's said within the floor time community. And those are not wrong, but those are just one small piece. So it'd be like saying, modern medicine is just, taking a pill. Well, for some people it might be, but that's we all, those in the medical fields know it's a whole lot more than that. So, what floor time is at its core, it is a modality for encouraging relating, communicating, and thinking for children. And it's for all children, not just children with special needs, but for all children and their caregivers and other really meaningful relationships. The ultimate goal of floor time, though, even though that's kind of what the technique is, because floor time is an intervention, but the goal of floor time is really to habilitate social emotional health and ultimately, in the long run, achieve high levels of self-awareness and awareness of others. That was what my father kind of really was focused on when he created this, because he was the first professional, medical professional as a child psychiatrist to ever say that we have an outline of what social emotional health looks like in kind of the natural developmental phases. And this is another important facet of floor time because a lot of people confuse this. He actually created two separate but related components that people associate with floor time. One is called the DR model, or now being called the Greenspan DR model. And this refers to his outline or framework for what social emotional health looks like and can look like for the vast majority of children, even with things like autism. And then floor time is the intervention, or now as it's known, the Greenspan Floortime Approach, which is his version of floor time, is intervention that is meant to facilitate and habilitate this type of development across these social emotional lines.
And so can you tell a little bit about how they differ in terms of how they're delivered and how parents or educators or whoever might be kind of using this as a tool to facilitate communication?
Absolutely. So, the Greenspan DR model, which is kind of was the first thing he developed. He actually wrote his first book. It was a monograph called Intelligence and Adaptation. He wrote in I think 78, published in 79. And he really synthesized three major groups of theories. He took a lot of the analytical work that he had done and with Freud and Erikson and integrated that with actually behavioral work that was being done by Skinner and Lovaas at the time, as well as the idea of Piagetian stages, moving through these different stages of development, and integrated them all together to say that children at birth have emotional systems, and every experience we have somehow gets interpreted emotionally, and it's these emotional experiences that drive our development. And he was actually the first person in the early 70s to start saying that, and now a lot more people have agreed with it. And so that is used for evaluations. We use that to set goals and evaluate children. So if you're a psychologist or a developmental pediatrician or some other medical professional who does a lot of assessments and evaluations, you will want to use this Greenspan DIR model to understand each child's unique profile of strengths and weaknesses. Now, it's different than the diagnosis, right? He always wanted to focus on the individual child, not the diagnostic, kind of symptomatic criteria that they may have met. Not to ignore those things, but he wanted the individual profile he felt was more important. And then once we understand the individual profile, we can create a treatment plan that is based on the child's social emotional needs. And that's where floor time or the Greenspan Floortime Approach comes in as intervention. Now, this intervention, and there's another area of confusion, some people think of it as a standalone intervention. Some people think of it as an integrated intervention, and it's actually both. Floor time can be done on its own by parents and professionals and babysitters and grandparents and even siblings, right? Or even just educators. But it can also be integrated into an actual occupational therapy, speech and language pathology, mental health, or educational program because the goals do not compete with the other goals. But now the techniques might disagree a little bit, but the goals don't compete, right? Every parent, every professional I've ever worked with wants a child to develop social emotional health. The question is, how do we get there? And that's where floor time may differ from some current practices.
Right. And, one of the unique things about this floor time approach as in terms of intervention is that you're really following a child's lead. And tell me what that does in terms of kind of self-efficacy for the child and just their own well-being moving forward, their emotional well-being and their motivation to connect and continue to work towards increasing their creativity and their thinking and developing relationships.
Absolutely. And I will say this is where even some of the differences with the variations of floor time in the community come into play. My father had a very specific definition of what following the child's lead means. And unfortunately, some of that definition has been lost in translation as people have interpreted it from his various books. What I'm going to share with you is kind of his definition of it. So really what it means is joining the child in their world, getting down on their level, showing an interest in them and what they're interested in. And that may mean some parallel play. It may mean direct interaction with the child. It may even mean, and this is where the difference lies with some different communities, it may even mean giving the child something they need without them exactly showing you they need it yet. Because one of the main challenges with things like developmental delays, especially autism, is children struggle to communicate. And so they're not going to necessarily say, hey, pick me up, tickle me, toss me, squish me, because they don't have the tools yet to do that. But part of following the child's lead means giving them emotionally and physically what they need, possibly even before they've shown you or told you they need it, because what we're doing is activating their systems. We're nurturing them and providing them with support, and that is part of following the lead.
And it seems like when you do that, you give them ownership over what happens next. But then you don't stop there. Then you get into that challenging phase. I'd love for you to kind of walk us through the next two principles.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so that first stage of following the lead, right? We're acknowledging what the child is interested in. We're showing them respect. We're showing them trust. We're showing them that we're going to listen to them. So hopefully someday they listen to us. And it gives them a sense of control over their world, right? That's another thing that so many children with communication challenges struggle with. They feel the world is out of their control because communication gives us the ability to impact our environment. I point and then someone looks at what I'm pointing at or hands me what I'm pointing at, right? Communication is a tool for controlling the world around us. So we want to first start with that, helping the child feel empowered and control. And then we challenge them to interact and think. And again, this is another variation where different communities describing floor time will focus on different pieces. A lot of people say it's just affect-based and relationship-based, and those are true, but it's also interaction, communication-based, and thinking-based. Meaning we never are doing floor time if we're not working on communicating and thinking, right? A lot of people will pick one piece and they'll still say, well, I followed the child's lead, but then you told them what to say. And I said, well, who's doing the thinking there? Or you showed them what to do and how to move their body. Who's doing the thinking there? Unfortunately, the adult is doing the thinking. And while certainly children learn through modeling, it's not about direct modeling. It's through incidental modeling they learn. They're watching the world around them because they're interested in it, not because someone gave them a reward or told them what to do. So we're constantly challenging them to interact with us, and we create a reciprocal exchange, which is the kind of foundation for everything we want to do. And once we're in a reciprocal exchange, that can even just be a look, a smile, showing eye contact with enthusiasm. Every one of these nonverbal or preverbal gestures are where communication begins. And once we start scaffolding that and building up through what we call the developmental milestones, then we're expanding the challenge to incorporate more complex patterns of interaction. So if the first time we give a little tickle, we get a look and a smile. The second time we go in more slowly and they pull our hands down. The third time we go in more slowly, they pull our hands down and we're struggling and playing tug of war. And then they use both hands. And the fourth or fifth time, all of a sudden, they're trying to hand us their feet. They're showing us their belly. They're doing all these different gestures and kind of more adaptive responses to show us how they can adjust and their communication become more dynamic, adaptive, and creative to accomplish their goal of playing a game with their caregiver that's as simple as tickles.
That's amazing. And I can just see how that would be such a positive experience for the parent too, to be involved in this approach. Because then it's not about you doing something to help their child. You're actually facilitating the relationship, the communication between the parent and the child, and facilitating that connection, which we know is such an important part of social and emotional well-being and mental health.
Absolutely. No, I mean, and I will say, as rewarding and beneficial as it can be, it's also challenging.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to, and I think everybody will intrinsically know that as they're listening to this. But I do want to say that because I think it's important to go into this with an honest understanding of what to expect, because I've worked with families who have built new and deeper relationships with their child that they never thought they'd have. I mean, literally, I had a 22-month-old who said "dada" for the first time a few weeks ago. A 6-month-old and his mom started playing games where he was smiling as she was coming down to tickle him and do different games. These were things they weren't sure were ever going to happen, and they happened within just a couple of sessions. Now, I'm not saying that's true for all kids and parents, but what it does is it helps parents understand their child and their child's needs. It's less about formal techniques and intervention. It's more about, hey, why is my child not doing these things I want them to do? Not just how do I get them to do them? Because we can never come up with an effective treatment plan if we don't know what the cause of the challenge is. And if we do, we're only addressing symptoms. And so what we're trying to do here is really address the core deficits, and then really the sky is the limit.
Right. Right. And, when you talk about respect and trust and control, I think that these are things that all kids would benefit from, right? And, the goal of many interventions is to stimulate a child's developmental growth. And when we're improving those parent-child interventions, we're changing their brains. And these are important outcomes for autistic kids, but it seems that children who are not autistic would also benefit from this approach. Can you talk about that?
Another great question. It's almost like we've had this conversation before.
Interesting how that is.
The absolute truth is that, yes, this is applicable to all children. It's appropriate and helpful for all children. And the reason is because it is not a framework for autism. It is not a framework for special needs. It's a framework for natural social emotional health. The process that hopefully most of the population has gone through, but also the process that many children with these delays are not naturally moving through. Now, the idea is not to teach them through discrete learning opportunities of what empathy is, because you can't teach a child what empathy is cognitively. I mean, you can definitely describe it, but you can't help them feel it and understand it until they've had experiences with it. And so my father used to say, and this is true for all children, if you want a child to develop empathy, show them empathy. If you want a child to learn to think, give them opportunities to think, right? I mean, it's so straightforward, but we are all convinced to do the opposite. And so we have found, and when my father wrote wrote the Greenspan DIR model and described it in his books, he wrote 40 books in his career. And also he described the Greenspan Floortime Approach. He wrote each book about a different population. And so some of it was just for natural kind of family relationships. He wrote one called The Essential Partnership. Actually, the first book he wrote that popularized the word floor time, he wrote with my mom, called The Essential Partnership. It was just about what all parents should be doing with their child, regardless of diagnosis. And then later on, he wrote books that was specific to special needs, autism, and learning challenges. And we work a lot with kids with behavioral and learning challenges that kind of fit into a gray area developmentally, where they do have some social and communication deficits that may not be present all the time, but show up during times of conflict and stress. And these children are usually diagnosed with ADD or ADHD or behavior problems, when the reality is there's a strong social emotional component to this. And I'm not discounting other components, but I am saying that that is oftentimes the biggest component. These children are not feeling safe, secure, and in control of their world, right? And as a result, they're reacting to it by either digging in and getting rigid because it's a way of being in control, or lashing out and reacting because it's a way of rebelling against other people's control.
Right. And I think it's so important that you said that about that gray area, because there's so many kids who don't fit neatly into a diagnostic box. But we don't say to those parents, oh, the struggles that they have, they don't mean anything. Those kids still need support. We just have to find the right kind of support for them. We just don't tell them, oh, they'll be fine. Don't worry about it. Right. It's nice to know that there are things that we can do to support those kids. You don't have to have a diagnosis in order to benefit from support, particularly interventions that target a child's area of weakness.
Absolutely. And what I will say also about those populations of individual children and adolescents who we work with and who we've met over the years, actually, the program itself at our office is not a required component of a lot of these kind of facilitating this growth and development. It doesn't require an intensive therapeutic intervention program. A lot of times, especially for some of the kids in that gray area, getting support and guidance on what you can do at home is more important than sending your child to an office to do training, because the parental relationships, especially with mom and dad and other caregivers, are the foundation for our social emotional health. And it's not that they're not there in these cases. It's that they need to be deeper and nurtured in possibly new ways that maybe weren't necessarily naturally explored. And so we give parents that guidance. And if they're on board, we see significant growth. Sometimes it's hard. Schedules, life, our own challenges and baggage we're bringing into relationships, right? All of these things can have a positive or negative impact on these outcomes. But what we tell parents, and we tell parents with all diagnoses, we literally say, the more you do at home, the less I want to see you at my office. And it's not the best business advice, but it's, but nonetheless, it's what's best for the kids.
Right. And it's so interesting because sometimes we have in our minds that unless our child is behind a door with a professional, that they're not getting the benefit that they would from a home-based intervention, where the research is actually showing that there are significant improvements in kids in terms of their emotional functioning, their communication, their daily living skills with the home-based floor time. And the parents perceive those positive changes in the parent-child interaction as a result. So how is the home-based approach different from the approach or the intervention that they would get in a clinic?
Yeah, I mean, there's two types of home-based supports. One is with a therapist who goes into the home, and one is by the parents, who are doing it at home. I would say when it's the parents doing it, and when they can, or the grandparent, or the nanny who's with them, or the au pair or babysitter, and we've worked with all types, it tends to be very, very positive, right? I've worked with kids who have an au pair or a nanny because the parents are both working, and we get that. That's a requirement oftentimes. I've worked with other families where one parent stays home, and that's wonderful too. The bottom line, though, is that this needs to be done consistently and fairly intensively to really have a positive impact. Any amount will have a positive impact, but it will be a much slower process of achieving the goals we want. And so ultimately, it needs to be integrated, not just into a 20 or 30-minute session at home with mom or dad, but into daily life routines. Because why are we going to work on, let's use an analogy of learning a first or second language, right? If we're learning a new language as an adult, which is actually similar to many kids learning their first language with special needs, because they're not naturally learning them, so we have to help them learn in new ways. what's the best way to do it? Going to a language class 1 hour a week or 2 hours a week, even 3 hours a week? Or immersing yourself in that language, utilizing that language and thinking process all the time by possibly even going to that country or surrounding yourself by a community of people speaking it. That has been proven to be the most effective way to learn.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so when we work with parents, we try to help them understand that this is not a one-off, 1 day a week intervention. This is something that really needs, it doesn't have to be taking tons and tons of your time, but getting ready for bed at night, making a snack, getting dressed in the morning. These routines can utilize floor time-based principles where instead of just saying, give me your hand, put this on your head, where you put your shoes on, which is all adult-led directions. Oh boy, I got these shoes. I think they go in my hands. Now the parent's playing a little game and the child shakes their head and puts it on their foot automatically.
Right.
And I can't tell you how many times they've done that when I've pretended a shoe is a glove. Right. But now the child takes it from you and shows you how to do it versus you telling them how to do it. Who's doing the thinking in either scenario again? Right. So little things can have big ripple effects. But think about what else happens when you're playing a game around a transitional object or a transitional time, like getting ready. No longer is it about following instructions and doing something I don't want to do. Now I'm taking control over the experience and doing something that I'm choosing to do.
Right. And then what I'm seeing and hearing is this naturalistic approach. And it makes it fun for the kids when you're integrating it into their day, the way that you've described. Now, one of the things that, when you describe some of these examples, in my head, I picture very young kids, but this is an intervention and approach that helps kids of different ages. Can you talk a little bit about the ages of children who benefit from this intervention and this approach?
Absolutely. And one of the things about the Greenspan DIR model, which is the framework to identify each child's profile, is does have age expected norms, right? Like we want to be developing language between 1.5 and 2.5, but or earlier even. But if it's not developing at that age range, we are going to go back and work with the child developmentally, not chronologically. We could have an 8-year-old or a 7-year-old who is still working on some of those basic linguistic skills and communication skills, but we're going to work with them at an earlier age. It's not that we're going to be, putting them in a high chair if they're 7 or 8, but we are still going to be doing more physical games versus pretend play and fantasy-based play, which is probably more appropriate. Right? We are going to be doing work on those basic communication, nonverbal or pre-verbal and verbal patterns versus just pushing language. Because developmentally speaking, we have to walk before we run and we gesture before we verbalize. And so we will work with children developmentally. And that means whether you're 8, 10, 15, or 20, we need to figure out where the developmental challenges are. So that's what we're going to start working on. A good example of this, I worked with an 18-year-old years ago who was struggling to communicate. A lot of his language was scripted and echolalic. He would repeat the same phrase, granddad yelled at me, granddad yelled at me. And he would just cycle through it over and over. And because that was his kind of communication pattern that he was comfortable with, like a kid asking the same question over and over, he would get stuck and he couldn't communicate with his family, sister, or people around him. Well, once we use some of these tools at our disposal within this kind of Greenspan Floortime approach, we found out that by following his lead and say, oh, granddad yelled at you, instead of trying to shut down the behavior, right? We leaned into it and granddad yelled at you. Oh no. Oh, granddad, don't yell. And he looked at me like, finally, someone's listening.
Right.
And all of a sudden he said something else about grandma. And now that we're exploring it, now we're following his train of thought and challenging him a little bit to communicate more by being empathetic and supportive, but also challenging him a little. We found out he actually accidentally hurt his grandmother when he was a young child, and his granddad yelled at him, and it stuck with him for the last 15 years. And as a result of it, he wasn't able to get past it emotionally. He was so focused on it. His language, social skills, everything else suffered. And no one acknowledged what he was saying because they thought it was an echolalic kind of scripted ideation. And so we got past it, and within 2 weeks, he was having conversations with his little sister. I mean, and again, this is a drastic example.
Right.
But nonetheless, it's possible for at least him. And
Absolutely.
So we work with a lot of adolescents and teenagers and kind of elementary age school kids who are older than the pediatric population typically is, but we work with them in the same way because guess what? Whether you're 2, 5, 15, or 20, you need these skills to happen in a certain order. You need to develop them. Again, we don't just walk before we run. We crawl before we walk, and we roll over and sit up before we crawl, right? So every part of our development has a trajectory that needs to be followed to a certain degree in order to have a healthy neurological system.
Yes. And when I'm hearing that example, I'm thinking you validated that young person's experience. And then it's like almost like a relief. And now they can move on to something else, right? But again, it's about being heard and being understood, and then feeling, and then you also increase the safety, because it's now I'm not afraid that someone's going to shut me down for repeating this phrase. They validated my experience. Now I can kind of relax a little bit and then connect about something else that I might be interested in.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so the research it's so important, the work that you're doing, because, I'm reading the research, and we know that there's this link between social emotional skills all the way beginning when kids are in kindergarten, and it has outcomes for young adults in terms of education, in terms of employment, in terms of mental health. And so the skills that you're building and you're facilitating in terms of growth when kids are younger and when they're teens has such a positive impact when they are young adults and when they are growing and aging into, themselves as full adults. And so I really appreciate the work that you're doing, because again, it has long-term implication and benefits to so many people.
Absolutely. And just to comment on that, I think a lot of parents and even professionals get so focused on the goal set of what's right in front of them, which is school readiness oftentimes. And the reality is actually social emotional health and skills are also strong, if not definitive, driving forces for our academic success, let alone our life success later on, right? And so we don't need to be separating the two. A lot of people think of academic success based on compliance and memorizing information, whereas the reality is, again, all the academic research is also showing that social emotional health and skills by age 3 or 5 are indicative of a child's ability to succeed in school, as well as later in life with job attainment, educational attainment, and lower incidence of criminal and substance abuse.
Right. And that's why it's so important to kind of look at the whole child in terms of their needs, and not just the academic piece, not just the language piece, and not just the social piece. We put all of this together. It's an integrative approach, which is probably why you not only do floor time, but you also work with speech and language pathologists and occupational therapists, because some kids that we work with have complex needs and they need more than just one thing. But when you do them together, it just enhances the outcomes for those kids.
Right. Absolutely. And I think what we've found clinically, my father knew intrinsically, is that, these interventions, whether it be speech, OT, education, mental health, they all need to be not provided identically, but they need to be housed under the same roof, if you will, philosophically. Because while you do need different interventions and every child needs something a little different, if they are drastically different approaches, if one person is very demanding and one person is very, one intervention is very child-led, it creates confusion for the child, but it also creates more stress for the child. Because in one instance, they're giving the chance to think. In one instance, that's dogmatic, kind of following the rules. And so what we've found is that kids don't do well within those two drastic, polarized kind of types of intervention. And it's not that everybody has to do floor time. It's that whatever you're doing should be, generally speaking, within the same framework, because if you have different therapists working in different ways, the child is the one who's kind of caught in between it all.
Right. And that's a really important point, because again, you don't want confusion, because if we're thinking about enhancing social emotional skills, we don't want to add stress, right, to a child's experience when they are learning these skills. And again, ultimately, the goal is to help kids and young people think for themselves, to develop those thinking skills, those abstract skills, to make connections, to form meaningful connections with other people, and feel confident in those skills that they've developed and they've learned.
Yeah, well, and again, just another example, something I hear a lot, unfortunately, because the families we work with, they often get recommended to come to us from other sources, many doctors in the area who refer to us. And some of them really understand, I think, a lot of what social emotional interventions are and how they're meant to help this kind of holistic picture of the child. But then we get other doctors and referral sources, and I don't want to criticize anyone, but I want to play off this point, is that they'll recommend they come to us for social emotional interventions to help the child learn to communicate and socialize, and then they'll send them to a behaviorist to get rid of their negative behaviors. And I'm like, how does this work? Because in one sense, we're trying to nurture and encourage and entice and support and give the child more opportunities to really become themselves and feel trusting in the environment and feel in control of the environment. And then the actual symptomatic outcome of their social emotional delays is being treated in a behavioral method where they're losing control and effectively being put upon to stop being listened to. And basically their expressions, which may be maladaptive and inappropriate, nonetheless, are being completely shut down and ignored. And we need to acknowledge the feelings while shutting down the behavior, certainly, if we can. But how do we do that if we have these two polar opposite approaches?
Right. And I do see that nurturing approach being very powerful and having a big impact with so many kids that I've seen, so many young people that I've seen. And I really appreciate you taking the time to educate our listeners about floor time and the Greenspan Floortime Approach. And now, so if listeners want to know more, what is the best way for them to connect with you and your center?
There's two main resources out there. One of them is the floortimecenter.com. That is my center. We have a couple locations in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, as well as some partners in and around the country and actually the world. But also, there's plenty of free resources on there. There's some free lectures I did. There's some articles that were written, some research. There's even an interactive tree, what we call the interactive learning tree, which is basically my father's framework, the Greenspan DR framework, as a picture. And on it, there are little Easter eggs you can hover over, and a 5-minute lecture describing that principle will pop up. In addition to that, StanleyGreenspan.com is a wonderful place for people to take longer lectures, sign up for an 11-hour professional course. There's tons of articles my father wrote. It's really the only place, and I will say this, it is the only place you can find as much content of his that's available, because we are focused on curating his work in his version of floor time, which is the Greenspan Floortime Approach, as opposed to other people's interpretations of it.
Wonderful. And we will put links to all of that information in the show notes. Jake, thank you so much for all that you and your team are doing to help kids who learn differently, think differently, and experience the world differently. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Wilson. This has been a pleasure. And I think, the second time's a charm.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.